Con ustedes, Adam Kujawa, Head of Malware Intelligence de Malwarebytes Labs.
Hello, folks. My name's Adam Kujawa. Today we're going to be talking about the Cybercrime Tactics and Techniques report of Q1 2020, Attack on Home Base. And what this is going to talk about primarily are threats that are being spread using the coronavirus or COVID-19 threat as a theme. As mentioned, my name is Adam Kujawa, and I've been a director at Malwarebytes Labs for over 8 years, over 15 years in the industry, fighting cybercrime behind the scenes and in the front lines. So employees are accessing company resources through VPNs, cloud-based services, and communications tools from their personal networks and sometimes personal computers. In response, cybercriminals have been deploying campaigns to trick users into installing malware that steals login information for these sites, as well as provide remote control for endpoints to the attacker. The whole point being basically utilizing employee accesses to corporate networks remotely as a springboard to get into the more valuable corporate network. And so we're going to talk about some of the malware that's involved in that, some of the tricks that they've used in order to fool people, and how their activity has been spiking over the last few months. So threats like Emotet and TrickBot are still a big concern for businesses all over the world. However, the threats we're going to be covering in this section are specifically using COVID-19 themed campaigns to spread. In fact, many of the families we've seen being installed by these campaigns have had very little success prior to the last few months. These changes represent a shift by cybercriminals to focus on a new target, your home base. So pre-COVID-19, the approach of infecting business networks involved malware specifically designed to infect business networks, exploiting their interconnectedness and or abusing common applications which were out of date or misconfigured. Meanwhile, the consumer-focused malware mainly involves stealing information for phishing or pushing files and ads to users. This is what we saw in the past. However, once COVID-19 started spreading globally and workers moved out of the office to their homes, suddenly things like VPNs and cloud services became something accessible to these employees, even if they didn't have it before. Alternatively, it means that attacks meant to infect corporate networks through employee endpoints weren't going to work very well anymore. And we got a little animation that kind of shows this, where workers are moving out of their offices to home, utilizing private networks, utilizing cloud services now, and accessing a whole different framework. So to counter this, business-focused attackers, purchased and deployed consumer-focused malware that was designed to primarily steal credentials, which, beyond giving the attackers access to consumer assets, may also allow for the access of business assets by stealing cloud service passwords or hijacking a VPN connection in order to upload malware onto a company file server or access other company resources. The clear goal now seems to be to use the remoteness of employees as an asset to get to their employers' networks. And here we can see that cyber criminals who previously targeted only corporate networks are now focused on the consumer, utilizing consumer-focused malware in order to get to those networks and hopefully, in their minds anyway, be able to infect from remote. So our first film we're going to talk about is Ava Maria. So first observed in December 2018, the remote access Trojan Ava Maria is used for taking over the systems of its victims and providing the attackers with remote control capability of the system. It was first observed being spread through malicious phishing campaigns in 2018, and its presence on infected endpoints has been on the rise ever since. The Ava Maria remote access Trojan is available for cybercriminals to purchase on the dark web for about $23 for a monthly subscription. Over the last 3 months, we've seen an increase in detections of this threat, with a 109.6% increase between February and March. So Ava Maria has been observed recently spread through malicious phishing emails claiming to be information about effective face masks as well as other COVID-19 themed campaigns. And you can see an example of this email on the screen here. This is just a very simple one, but basically uses that COVID-19 threat, hoping to get people. We've observed around a 40% increase in netwired RC detections since the beginning of the year. During the summer of 2019, netwired RC was involved with a phishing campaign targeting the hotel industry in North America. This malware has been observed primarily through malicious phishing campaigns using numerous themes and ploys to get users to install the malware. A recent campaign claimed to be providing COVID-19 information from UNICEF, the children's organization, or the Children's Aid Organization. It's a charity, and it's pretty despicable, if you ask me, that the criminals will use such a good charity, such a good organization like this to try and spread their threats. But at the end of the day, the fact that we see cyber criminals using coronavirus as a theme at all is indicative of how much they don't really care about people. It's all about messing with our minds. It's all about using social engineering against us. So Loki Bot is the next one we're going to talk about, and you may have heard of this one. It's pretty popular. It's a well-known botnet which has been active since 2015. Its primary method of spreading has been through malicious emails or as a secondary payload for other downloader malware families. It's also known to use stenography, and it does that to hide malicious code inside of images that it downloads. So it's a very interesting tactic. In addition to masking as banks and shipping companies, Loki Bot has been seen by multiple security research groups recently as a possible payload for many of the COVID-19 themed phishing campaigns active today. During the coronavirus pandemic, we have seen a rise of 61.8% in detections of Loki Bot. And recently, we've observed this malware being pushed as an invoice for a medical supply vendor. And you got that right there. It's a very low-tech kind of attachment, invoice, and email. However, sometimes it's the amount of information they don't include, which gets people more interested in clicking on links and opening files. Next, we're going to talk about Azeralt, which is also a very popular malware. So it's a dangerous information stealing Trojan that has been on the scene since 2016. This malware can also act as a downloader for other malware and has previously been installed as a secondary payload for families like Emotet. So Emotet will compromise an endpoint, start spreading laterally, and then drop Azeralt after it has infected X amount of machines. The primary method of infection for this threat is through malicious phishing campaigns and drive-by exploits. So the Azeralt malware has remained a steady threat throughout 2019. Then starting in November, we began to see a larger increase in detections until around February. However, a comparison with March shows a 30.1% increase in detections of this threat month over month, proving that this threat is likely not going to go away anytime soon. Azeralt has also been observed recently as a possible payload for numerous COVID-19 themed attacks, including one asking the recipient for bulk quantities of ventilators, as well as being one of the payloads attached to a fake Johns Hopkins University application map, which we're going to talk about in a second. You may have already heard about from a few months ago. Danabot is a family of Trojan malware, which is what we're going to be talking about next. And it was first discovered being distributed through malicious emails with a focus in Australia. It's recently been distributed through malicious advertisements using the rig and Fallout exploit kits. However, Danabot's spread has expanded as of late. So while it used to only really target Australia, now we've seen it in various countries in Europe as well as North America. Danabot has been active since September of 2019, with a dip in detections between January and February. This dip resulted in a rise of 166% in detections between February and March. So Danabot is being spread in a lot of different ways, from exploit kit malvertising attacks, as we mentioned earlier, to malicious email campaigns. The Polish CERT organization recently sent a warning to their Polish citizens about a campaign pushing the Danabot malware through a malicious PowerPoint presentation. In addition to that, Danabot is one of the possible payloads we may see installed by the fake Johns Hopkins coronavirus map, which was first discovered in March. And if you haven't heard about this thing, well, it's well known at this point, but at the time, it was pretty unique. Johns Hopkins University created a map online in order to track coronavirus cases all over the world. Cybercriminals decided, well, this is a really good resource, so they took that map application, or at least a pretty good facsimile of it, and they put it into a standalone application and then told people to go and download it. If someone downloaded this application, it would create the map on their system. However, in the background, it would install additional malware. So we had to warn people about that, about sharing that kind of stuff. So if you do encounter anything that says, I'm an application that will tell you how many coronavirus cases are happening, or basically any information that you could get from looking online, but rather have it on your desktop, and it's not from a trusted source or a trusted vendor, it's just some random third-party application, I would highly recommend avoiding it, at least for the time being. So phishing emails and scary maps are not the only criminal operation that we've seen that's taking advantage of the current state of the world. In fact, home shoppers are actually at a greater risk than ever, with an increase in credit card skimmers found on web store checkout pages. In addition, government-sponsored actors are trying to blend their attacks in with the flood of coronavirus-themed scams. So we're going to talk about this. Panic buying, hoarding, and a drastic change in how we purchase goods from in-store to delivery and pickup has resulted in rush deployments of online order forms, price manipulation, counterfeit goods, and, of course, online scams. Cybercriminals have focused on stealing financial data from users and have increased the compromise of online order forms and installation of card skimming code on these web pages. And we've seen a 26% increase in this kind of attack from February to March 2020. So basically what this is talking about is that a cyber criminal will maybe compromise a website, a web store of some kind, and rather than modify the code or add some new, malicious feature to the back end, what they'll do is basically layer a fake or redirected web shell frame on the actual payment form. So where you go to put in your credit card number and all that information, that is basically a different version of it is superimposed onto the real site. And when you plug your information into that layered form, it gets sent to the bad guy. It doesn't actually go to the payment processor, the vendor, In some cases, they'll reroute it to make it look like it did happen, like everything's fine. But in a lot of cases, they won't. So there's a lot of different ways to avoid this kind of stuff, from using a VPN, which we'll talk about later, to just opening up the developer tools for your browser. Sometimes that can prevent this attack from being successful. You can actually find more about the rise in card skimmers and some notable companies whose customers have been victims of this method on the Malwarebytes Labs blog. And we have a post called Online Credit Card Skimming Increased by 26% in March. I highly recommend checking it out. We've also seen COVID-19 used as a theme by state-sponsored actors. In fact, multiple APT groups from Russia, North Korea, and other countries have jumped on the bandwagon of trying to trick their targets into interacting with their spear phishing attacks using COVID-19. You can read all about these attacks, excuse me, you can read all about these attacks and how they work in a report released called APTs and COVID-19, How Advanced Persistent Threats Use Coronavirus as a Lure. And one of the most interesting aspects of this particular report is that a lot of these tactics we've seen used by commercial cyber criminals before. And just kind of overall, we've seen a move away from the more specialized, highly developed, secretive attack methods that we saw before with a lot of state-sponsored actors. So Flame, Stuxnet, a lot of these different state-sponsored APT malware families that used to be kind of the top peak of malware development are kind of going by the wayside. We're seeing a lot of the same technology used by these kind of threats, either being leaked by groups like the shadow brokers or just being discovered by really curious cyber criminals who like to tear things apart, like to understand and create new methods of infection. So we've seen a lot of those kind of tactics move over to the commercial side, where we see cyber criminals attacking businesses, utilizing exploits like Eternal Blue and a lot of other different manual methods of infection to spread throughout networks. While at the same time, we've seen state-sponsored actors who, like I said before, usually try to hide in the shadows, utilizing more commercial forms of attack. So that might be something from sending a campaign of spear phishing attacks. That might be something like using commercial malware. In fact, it was quite a few years ago that we saw the Syrian government actually using an off-the-shelf commercial remote access Trojan called Blackshades to target rebels in a certain way. Well, so supposedly it was the Syrian government. It could have been anybody. That's who we think, though. But regardless, it's not an entirely uncommon thing that's done. However, it is something we're seeing more of. And at the end of the day, really, it just blends and confuses those of us who are trying to figure out, hey, is this a state? Is this just a random criminal who's in it for financial reasons? Or is this a government-sponsored actor who's in it for political or some other reason? So, when we see kind of a merge of all those tactics, it's hard to tell who or who, and it makes for an interesting landscape, I guess. So let's talk about protection real quick. How do you stay safe from all these threats that I talked about? Basically, you want to protect home base, and there are many ways to do that. For example, you first want to deploy security software on all devices, be it for work, personal use, mobile, or otherwise. Most of the threats that we've described here are easily detectable by most vendors, mainly because they've been around for so long. They're not just brand new. They're not doing anything that's necessarily novel or unique. So most vendors are able to either identify it because they've seen it before, or at least identify it based on its behavior. Next, we recommend you to utilize a VPN for work or sensitive personal activities. This isn't going to prevent malware. In fact, it definitely won't prevent malware from infecting your system. I know a lot of people like to push that as kind of like a selling point for VPNs, but the reality is a VPN can protect your activities, it can protect your location, your identity, but it can't stop you from downloading something that will infect your system. And it can't stop things like drive-by exploits if there's an exploit out there that will, attack your whatever browser you're using. So this really just creates an additional layer of security while you shop online, and in order to avoid things like the card skimmers that we talked about earlier. So you want to look out for that kind of stuff. A VPN sometimes can screw up the scripts and the operations of cyber criminals trying to use card skimmers and things like that. And just overall, it's a good idea because there's a lot of third-party intrusive tracking scripts these days. They're collecting profiles on you. They're collecting information about your habits, about what you're interested in, where you spend the most time, where you click most on the page in some cases. And that information often is utilized by advertisers to create profiles on what kind of ads you would be most interested in looking at. And unfortunately, over the last 10 years or so, a lot of the efforts done by the advertising community, by the advertising industry, to try and help identify better targets, without a better word, targets for their ads, have also created an ecosystem that makes cyber criminals' efforts a little more specific and targeted, where we had seen back when malvertising was a huge problem, a lot of these same systems that create these profiles about you were being used by cyber criminals to determine who would be the best target for the ransomware. And that might come down to their age, their, where they live, what kind of software they're using. Like, for example, if you see, 3 potential victims, 2 of them are using, or one of them's using Chrome, one of them using Firefox, and one of them is using Internet Explorer from a version of Windows XP they still have installed on their old home system. Who do you think's the one that's going to be most likely to fall victim to the ransomware, and who's going to be the most likely to pay? So that's something you have to, take into consideration. So in addition to that stuff, don't go chasing waterfalls. Please stick to the online shops and news sites that you're used to. Misinformation is everywhere right now. It's on social media. It's on so-called news sites. Before sharing something you aren't really sure about, but it sounds really good, do a little research or just stick to the sites you've known and trusted for a while. So while, yeah, there's a lot of misinformation out there, these same sites that might be using headlines that are more clickbaity than others, especially in reference to coronavirus and to things like death tolls or protection information or things like that, can easily be utilized or be a tactic utilized by criminals to send you somewhere for redirection. So you might click on a news site thinking, oh, I'm going to learn about this particular aspect of COVID-19, and you end up going to a drive-by exploit site, or you end up going to some sort of survey form, or you end up downloading something or giving information to someone accidentally. The possibilities really are endless, but it's just more important, or so important, to make sure you trust what you're looking at. You don't share stuff unless you know that it's not only legitimate but also safe, and just kind of avoid places which look like they could be sketchy. So next, if you can, reduce entering financial information repeatedly. I know this is not necessarily along the same lines of COVID, but since we have seen an increase in web skimmers, this is a time to maybe consider how often am I putting my credit card information into websites. So that means if you're shopping online and you happen to use 10 different online stores, they're not all the same. You're not just going to Amazon or whatever and downloading everything you can or buying everything from them, but you actually go to individual web stores. You might have to enter your financial information 10 times just to accomplish this. And that creates 10 possibility or 10 opportunities, I guess, for cyber criminals to have compromised those stores, and for you likely to lose your information to them because they've compromised these online stores. So to kind of fight this, rather than measuring the odds of, am I going to get hit by this? Is this form safe or not? Look into kind of a wallet service. That's something like PayPal or Amazon Pay, Google Pay, Samsung Pay, Apple Pay. There's so many of them out there these days. Many of these services are accepted by a lot of vendors. Not all of them, and you can't always hope that you'll be able to use your PayPal account at a store that doesn't accept PayPal, and you might have to enter your financial information there. But many of these services, like I said, are accepted by most vendors. And if you can avoid plugging in your credit card information really into a payment form over and over again, you'll reduce the chance of it getting stolen. So that's something to keep in mind. And there's also, if you're especially paranoid, there are services like privacy.com. And what they do is that you work with them, you create an account, you lock or link kind of your bank account or a bank account to their site. Also, if you don't feel safe about doing that, then don't do it. But it generates new random credit card numbers. So you can use a one-time kind of thing. So you just say, oh, I want a credit card number for $50. I'm going to make a purchase on this website I don't trust. And you give them the number. Let's say it ends up that site has been compromised, that the cyber criminals now have access to that credit card number and try to use it later, but can't. Nothing happens. Nothing works. And that's the whole goal of privacy.com. So very useful for that. There are other services out there, I'm sure, that do the same thing. So I'll look out for them. If you've got one that's with a brand that you trust, and I'll highly recommend investigating. So finally, change passwords on a trusted computer. If you're running a network administration tool and have the ability to change passwords from a secured remote system, then do that. Otherwise, consider changing passwords on a non-infected system after you've cleaned the previous system. And this also means passwords for social media, banks, email, anything you may have access during the period that you think you were infected. So a lot of the malware, pretty much all the malware that we talked about today, has the ability to steal passwords. And that is what's going to be so important for cyber criminals. Because, yeah, they can, steal personal files all day long, but what's most important is, are they gaining access to additional resources? Are they finding some way to get, into that particular corporate network through your VPN, through your logins? If your company has, multi-factor authentication, I highly recommend that you employ that, because even if a password does get stolen, you could still lock out a criminal through most attacks, lock out most attacks by having two-factor authentication, where you've got a device that allows you to log in or plug in a code or something like that. There is malware out there, and it's becoming more common, that is infecting phones. That is basically the whole goal of it is to defeat two-factor authentication. So we can already say that eventually there's going to be something that defeats two-factor authentication or multi-factor authentication somehow, and we have to find some new way of securing things. Let's hope that time doesn't come for a while. But for right now, like I said, it's incredibly important to make sure you keep those passwords safe. Make sure you have multiple methods of logging into your corporate resources, and that don't trust, and that your company itself doesn't trust anyone just logging into a VPN or logging into a remote file server and assuming that, well, because they have the address and they have a password, that they're supposed to be there. Cybercrime is everywhere, and it always takes advantage of us being unprepared, of us not being correctly configured, and of us ignoring things that may have been a flag in front of us, but we are either not focused on it or too busy with something else. So this is an especially important time to be vigilant and to double check that all your security is top notch. So let's go ahead and wrap this up. Attackers are getting more creative while also leaning on older malware for more exploratory missions. Though the fact that criminals have purchased these families rather than developing new home employee-focused corporate malware means that they don't really believe that they'll need to use this forever. They're not developing, malware at home or that is meant to target consumers and then automatically start to attack corporate networks. So we can expect these things to change, drastically throughout the year. Because, like I said, they probably don't expect this to happen forever. And in fact, when we wrote this report, we expected to see a pre-COVID attack conditions return in the near future. And now we've kind of seen this. Families like Emotet, TrickBot, Ryu, Conti ransomware have all been more active or created over the last few weeks and few months. So the bad guys are jumping back on the horse. They took a break there during the fall or the summer and a lot of the spring. The coronavirus outbreak, the pandemic has affected all industries, but be it good guys or bad guys in some way, shape, or form. But we are seeing, new versions of malware, which was causing a lot of trouble for businesses back in 2019. We're seeing greater development of their tactics and even more malware that utilizes more manual control, which is kind of a lot more similar to what we've seen from state-sponsored APT groups, where you'll have an operator who says, I don't want you to just just automatically spread everywhere and encrypt everything, but I want you to only go after these host names, these IP addresses, these certain files, things like that. And that's becoming more common too. So that could also kind of represent a shift away from most malware authors who in the past had relied upon malware to automatically exploit, automatically infiltrate, and spread across corporate networks to one where they have a little more control. Now, this could mean bigger attacks. This could also mean, fewer attacks. We'll have to see, because something like that requires a lot of intelligence gathering and effort. So I don't expect every single cyber criminal who gets their hand on a botnet to start attacking businesses. It's really the ones that are more intent and equipped to do it. But that's all from me, folks. I really appreciate you watching this. If you have any questions, please put them in the QA section. Otherwise, thank you so much. Have a fantastic day. Take care.
Agradecemos a Adam Kujawa por su participación en el IT Solutions Day.